The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban neighborhood of Maplewood. The air was cool, and the streets were alive with the faint hum of crickets and distant laughter from nearby homes. 16-year-old Marcus Johnson walked home from his part-time job at the local grocery store, his backpack slung over one shoulder and a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He'd earned every penny working late shifts to help his mom with household expenses. Life wasn't easy for Marcus or his family, but he carried himself with quiet determination, always striving to do what was right. As he turned onto Elm Street, Marcus noticed a police cruiser parked near the corner. Its flashing red and blue lights pierced through the evening calm, drawing curious glances from a few neighbors who peeked out their windows. At first, Marcus didn't think much of it. He assumed someone must have left their car unlocked or forgotten to bring in their trash cans. But as he approached, he saw two officers standing beside the vehicle, speaking in hushed tones. One of them glanced up and locked eyes with Marcus. For reasons he couldn't explain, Marcus felt uneasy. It wasn't unusual for him to see cops around the area. They often patrolled the streets after dark. But something about this moment felt different. His heart began to race as one of the officers stepped toward him, motioning for him to stop. "Hey, kid," the officer called out, his voice firm but not yet threatening. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Marcus froze mid-step, his mind racing. He hadn't done anything wrong. Why would they want to speak to him? Still, he forced himself to remain calm. "Yes, sir," he replied politely, stopping a few feet away. The officer narrowed his eyes, studying Marcus intently. "Do you live around here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer, or thought he did. "Yes, sir. Just down the block," Marcus said, gesturing vaguely toward his house. He tried to keep his voice steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the strap of his backpack. The second officer joined them now, his expression hard and unyielding. "We've been getting reports of some suspicious activity in this area," he said, his gaze sweeping over Marcus's worn sneakers and hoodie. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Marcus shook his head quickly. "No, sir. I don't even know what you're talking about." But the officers weren't satisfied. They exchanged a glance before stepping closer, their body language shifting from questioning to accusatory. "Take off your backpack," the first officer demanded, his hand resting conspicuously on the handle of his baton. Fear gripped Marcus like a vice. He hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Wasn't he supposed to cooperate? Yet something deep inside told him this situation wasn't going to end well no matter what he did. Slowly, he slipped the backpack off his shoulders and held it out, hoping they'd see there was nothing incriminating inside. Instead, the second officer snatched it from his hands without warning. "What's in here, huh?" he barked, rummaging through its contents. Marcus watched helplessly as books, snacks, and receipts spilled onto the ground. Nothing illegal, nothing dangerous, just the everyday belongings of a hardworking teenager trying to make ends meet. "This doesn't prove anything," the first officer snapped, frustration evident in his voice. "Where are you coming from?" "The grocery store?" Marcus stammered, pointing weakly in the direction he'd come from. "I work there. You can call them if you want." But the officers weren't listening anymore. Their demeanor had shifted. They seemed determined to find fault where none existed. Before Marcus could react, one of them grabbed his arm roughly, twisting it behind his back. Pain shot through his shoulder as he stumbled forward, crying out in shock. "Wait, what are you doing? I didn't do anything," Marcus pleaded, panic rising in his voice. But his words fell on deaf ears. The streetlights flickered above, illuminating the scene as the officer's aggression escalated, leaving Marcus terrified and confused. Little did they know Marcus's phone was still tucked safely in his pocket, and on speed dial was a number that could change everything. But for now, all he could do was endure the injustice unfolding before him, praying someone would intervene before it was too late. The cold pavement pressed against Marcus's cheek as he lay sprawled on the ground, his arms pinned painfully behind his back. His breath came in shallow gasps, each inhale laced with fear and confusion. The officers' voices were sharp and unyielding, their words cutting through the night like shards of glass. "Stop resisting!" one of them barked, though Marcus hadn't moved an inch since they'd forced him down. "Please, I'm not resisting," Marcus managed to choke out, his voice trembling. Tears stung his eyes, not just from the pain, but from the sheer disbelief that this was happening. He had done nothing wrong, nothing at all. Yet here he was, face pressed into the dirt, treated like a criminal under the flickering glow of the streetlights. The second officer crouched beside him, his face inches away. "You think we don't know what you're up to?" he growled, his tone dripping with accusation. "Kids like you always have something to hide." Marcus wanted to scream to tell them they were wrong, but he bit his tongue. Something deep inside warned him not to argue, not now when their frustration seemed ready to boil over into something far worse. Instead, he squeezed his eyes shut, focusing on the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. It felt deafening, drowning out everything else around him. From nearby houses, curtains twitched as neighbors peered outside, drawn by the commotion. Some looked concerned, others indifferent, but none stepped forward to intervene. One woman clutched her phone, hesitating before dialing a number. She whispered urgently into the receiver, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "There's something going on down the street. Looks like trouble." Meanwhile, Marcus's mind raced. He thought about his mother, who would be waiting for him at home. She'd worry if he didn't return soon. And then there was his little sister, Mia, counting on him to help her with her math homework later that evening. What would they think if they saw him like this, humiliated, powerless, and surrounded by people who saw him as a threat simply because of the color of his skin? As the officers continued their aggressive questioning, Marcus's thoughts turned inward. He replayed the events leading up to this moment, the innocent walk home, the routine stop and frisk request, the sudden escalation. None of it made sense. Why were they targeting him? Was it because of where he lived? How he dressed? Or was it something deeper? Something rooted in prejudice he couldn't escape no matter how hard he tried? Then, amidst the haze of fear and anger, a single thought pierced through. His father. Though Marcus rarely spoke about him, his parents had separated years ago. He knew exactly who his dad was. Attorney General Derek Johnson wasn't just any public figure. He was a man known for fighting injustice, advocating for fairness, and standing up for those without a voice. Growing up, Marcus had often felt overshadowed by his father's accomplishments, but tonight, that connection offered a glimmer of hope. Summoning every ounce of courage, Marcus twisted his head slightly, wincing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through his shoulder. "I need to make a call," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "My dad, he can explain everything." The officers exchanged skeptical glances, clearly unconvinced. "Oh yeah?" the first officer sneered. "And who's your dad supposed to be?" "Attorney General Derek Johnson," Marcus replied, firmly, meeting the man's gaze despite the fear coursing through him. For a brief moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Even the distant hum of crickets seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of Marcus's ragged breathing. One of the officers snorted derisively. "Nice try, kid. You really expect us to believe that?" But the other officer hesitated, his grip loosening ever so slightly. Whether it was doubt or curiosity, something in Marcus's tone gave him pause. After all, the Attorney General was a household name, a man whose presence commanded respect even among law enforcement officials. Could this scrawny teenager really be his son? Marcus seized the opportunity. "Check my phone," he urged, his voice rising with desperation. "It's true. Call him yourself if you don't believe me." For a long moment, the officers stood frozen, weighing their options. Finally, the second officer reached into Marcus's pocket and retrieved the device. With hesitant fingers, he scrolled through the contacts until he found the name listed, under Dad. Beside it was a number Marcus knew by heart, the same one he'd dialed countless times during family dinners or late-night conversations. The officer stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. Then with a sigh, he pressed the call button. As the line began to ring, Marcus closed his eyes, praying this nightmare would finally come to an end. Somewhere far away, a phone was about to answer, and when it did, the entire dynamic of this situation would change forever. The phone rang twice before it was answered. On the other end, Attorney General Derek Johnson's deep, authoritative voice filled the line. "Hello?" he said, his tone calm but tinged with curiosity. It was late, and calls at this hour were rare unless something urgent demanded his attention. For a moment, the officer holding the phone hesitated, glancing down at Marcus, who lay on the ground, still trembling but clinging to hope. Finally, clearing his throat, the officer spoke. "Mr. Johnson, this is Officer Reynolds from the Maplewood Police Department. We have your son here." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence so heavy it seemed to stretch across miles. When Derek responded, his voice had shifted. Gone was the casual warmth. In its place was a sharp edge that commanded respect. "What do you mean you have my son? What's going on?" Officer Reynolds exchanged a nervous glance with his partner, who stood nearby, arms crossed but visibly uneasy. "Sir, there's been some suspicious activity reported in the area," he began, stumbling over his words. "We stopped him for questioning and—" Before he could finish, Derek interrupted, his tone cutting like steel. "You stopped him for questioning? For what? My son is 16 years old. He works part-time at a grocery store and has never been in trouble with the law. Explain yourself." The weight of the Attorney General's authority pressed down on the officers like an invisible force. Even Marcus, lying prone on the cold pavement, could hear fragments of the conversation drifting through the night air. His father's voice carried a strength and conviction that made his chest swell with pride and relief. "Sir, I understand your concern," Officer Reynolds stammered, trying to regain control of the situation. "But we're just doing our job. There have been complaints about..." "Complaints about what?" Derek shot back, his voice rising slightly. "About a young man walking home from work? About a black teenager existing in his own neighborhood? Is that what you call suspicious activity, Officer Reynolds?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. From their vantage point, several neighbors watched silently as the tension escalated. Some whispered among themselves, while others simply stared, unable to look away from the unfolding drama. Marcus, though still pinned to the ground, felt a flicker of defiance ignite within him. Hearing his father challenge the officers gave him courage he hadn't known he possessed. For the first time since the ordeal began, he dared to speak up. "Dad," he called out, his voice shaky but determined. "They searched my bag. They didn't find anything because I didn't do anything wrong." At the sound of his son's voice, Derek's tone softened momentarily, but only for Marcus. To the officers, his words remained firm and unrelenting. "Let me be very clear," he said, each syllable deliberate and measured. "I want you to release my son immediately. If there's any issue here, we can discuss it properly, not with him face down on the street." Officer Reynolds swallowed hard, acutely aware of how precarious the situation had become. A routine stop and question had spiraled into something far more serious, and now they were dealing with one of the most powerful figures in the state. "Sir, we'll need to verify his identity first," he offered weakly, grasping at straws. "You already have his phone," Derek replied, his patience wearing thin. "And if that's not enough, I'll send someone over right now to confirm who he is. But let me make one thing absolutely clear. If my son isn't released within the next 5 minutes, I will personally ensure that every level of accountability is brought to bear on this department. Do I make myself understood?" The threat wasn't veiled. It was direct, unmistakable, and laced with the kind of power that left no room for argument. Officer Reynolds glanced at his partner, who nodded almost imperceptibly, signaling they had no choice but to comply. Reluctantly, the officer stepped forward and loosened his grip on Marcus's arm. "All right, kid," he muttered, his voice devoid of the earlier hostility. "Get up." Marcus pushed himself slowly to his feet, wincing as pain shot through his shoulder. His hoodie was torn and dirt smeared his face, but none of that mattered now. All that mattered was the fact that his father's intervention had turned the tide. As he stood there, brushing off the dust, he locked eyes with the officers, refusing to show fear despite the lingering ache in his body. From the phone, Derek's voice broke through once more. "Marcus, are you okay?" he asked, concern replacing the earlier sternness. "I'm fine, Dad," Marcus replied, his voice steadier now. "Just glad you picked up." "I'm on my way," Derek assured him. "Don't say another word until I get there." As the call ended, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The officers retreated to their cruiser, speaking in hushed tones as they debated what to do next. Meanwhile, Marcus stood under the dim glow of the streetlight, clutching his backpack tightly. Neighbors who had been watching began to disperse, murmuring quietly about what they'd witnessed. Though the immediate danger had passed, Marcus knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. This incident would leave scars, both visible and invisible. But for now, he allowed himself a small measure of relief. His father was coming, and when Derek Johnson arrived, the world would know exactly what had happened here tonight. The hum of a powerful engine cut through the quiet night air as a sleek black sedan turned onto Elm Street. Its headlights illuminated the scene, casting long shadows across the pavement where Marcus still stood, clutching his backpack tightly. Neighbors who had lingered to watch the drama unfold quickly stepped back, their curiosity giving way to awe as they recognized the vehicle and the man stepping out of it. Derek Johnson moved with purpose, his tall frame commanding attention, as he strode toward the group. Dressed in a tailored suit despite the late hour, he exuded authority and confidence. His presence alone seemed to shift the energy of the street, silencing whispers and drawing all eyes to him. For Marcus, seeing his father arrive felt like watching a storm roll in, powerful, inevitable, and impossible to ignore. "Marcus," Derek called out, his voice steady but laced with concern. He reached his son in 3 quick strides, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Are you all right?" Marcus nodded, though his trembling hands betrayed the calm exterior he was trying to maintain. "I'm okay, Dad," he said softly, meeting his father's gaze for the first time since the ordeal began. There was so much he wanted to say, but words failed him. Instead, he simply looked at Derek, silently pleading for guidance. Derek's expression softened as he studied his son's face. The dirt streaks, the torn hoodie, the faint bruising already forming along his cheekbone. Anger flickered in his dark eyes, but he kept it contained, focusing instead on assessing the situation. Turning to the officers, who now stood beside their cruiser looking uneasy, he spoke in a tone that brooked no argument. "What happened here tonight?" he demanded, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable weight. "And why was my son detained without cause?" Officer Reynolds stepped forward hesitantly, clearly intimidated by the Attorney General's imposing figure. "Sir, we received reports of suspicious activity in the area," he began, stumbling over his explanation. "We approached your son for questioning and things escalated." "Things escalated?" Derek repeated, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "You mean you assaulted an unarmed teenager because someone thought he looked suspicious? Do you even realize how reckless that is?" The accusation hung heavy in the air, leaving the officers visibly uncomfortable. Officer Reynolds shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing at his partner for support. But neither of them dared speak up. They knew they were on shaky ground, and having the state's top legal authority standing before them only made matters worse. Derek didn't wait for a response. Reaching into his coat pocket, he pulled out his phone and began dialing a number. "This isn't going to end here," he said firmly, addressing both the officers and the small crowd of neighbors who remained nearby. "I'm calling internal affairs right now. This department will be held accountable for what happened tonight." The threat sent a ripple through the gathered onlookers. Some nodded approvingly, while others exchanged nervous glances. The officers exchanged panicked looks, realizing the gravity of the situation. Their attempt to justify their actions crumbled under Derek's relentless scrutiny. But Derek wasn't done yet. Placing a protective arm around Marcus, he turned to address the neighbors directly. Let me ask you something, he said, his voice rising so everyone could hear. How many times have you seen this happen before? How many young men like my son have been treated this way simply because of the color of their skin? And how many times have you stayed silent? His words struck a chord, resonating deeply with those who had witnessed the incident. A few people looked away guiltily, while others murmured in agreement. One elderly woman stepped forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. "It's not right," she said softly. "None of this is right." Derek nodded, acknowledging her courage. "You're absolutely right," he replied. "But silence allows injustice to thrive. If we don't speak up, if we don't demand better, then nothing will change." As he spoke, Marcus felt a surge of pride mixed with sadness. Pride because his father was using his platform to fight for justice, and sadness because he understood just how widespread the problem was. He wasn't the first teenager to experience this kind of treatment, and unless something changed, he wouldn't be the last. Finally, Derek turned back to the officers, his expression hardening once more. "Consider yourselves on notice," he said, his voice cold and final. "Internal Affairs will be reviewing this incident thoroughly. Until then, I suggest you rethink how you approach situations like this in the future." With that, he guided Marcus toward the car, opening the passenger door and helping him inside. As they drove away from the scene, Marcus stared out the window, watching the streetlights blur past. The adrenaline that had kept him going was beginning to fade, leaving behind exhaustion and a deep sense of unease. "You did good tonight," Derek said after a moment, breaking the silence. "You stayed calm when most people would have panicked. That takes strength." Marcus managed a weak smile, though tears pricked at the corners of his eyes. "Thanks, Dad," he whispered. "But what happens now?" Derek sighed, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Now, we make sure this doesn't happen again. Not to you, and not to anyone else." As the car disappeared into the night, the wheels of justice began to turn. What had started as a routine stop had become a catalyst for change, and Marcus knew his life, and perhaps countless others, would never be the same. The next morning, the quiet suburb of Maplewood was abuzz with conversation. News of the previous night's incident spread like wildfire, fueled by whispers at bus stops, text messages between friends, and posts on social media. By sunrise, what had started as a tense confrontation between Marcus Johnson and two police officers had become a topic of heated debate across the community and beyond. At the center of it all was Derek Johnson, whose late-night call to Internal Affairs set off a chain reaction that no one could have anticipated. Within hours, investigators were dispatched to review body cam footage from the officers involved, interview witnesses, and gather statements from neighbors who had seen the altercation unfold. The officers themselves were placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the inquiry, a move that sent shockwaves through the local police department. For Marcus, however, the day began quietly. He woke up in his childhood bedroom, the events of the previous night still fresh in his mind. His mother, Angela, sat beside him on the edge of the bed, her face etched with worry. She had stayed up most of the night after Derek called to explain what had happened, and though she tried to mask her emotions, Marcus could see the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked for the third time, brushing a stray strand of hair from his forehead. "If you need anything at all, you tell me, all right?" Marcus nodded, forcing a small smile. "I'm fine, Mom," he assured her, though his voice lacked conviction. Truthfully, he didn't know how he felt. Relief? Fear? Anger? All of those emotions swirled inside him, making it hard to focus on anything else. Downstairs, the phone rang incessantly. Reporters, activists, and even curious acquaintances were calling, eager to hear Marcus's side of the story. Derek had already issued a brief statement to the press, emphasizing the importance of accountability and systemic reform. But he made it clear that Marcus would not be speaking publicly until they were certain of their next steps. For now, The family needed space to process everything that had happened. As the hours passed, Marcus found himself drawn to the window, staring out at the neighborhood he'd always called home. It looked the same as it always did. Tree-lined. Streets, tidy lawns, children playing in driveways, but something about it felt different now. The sense of safety he'd once taken for granted was gone, replaced by an awareness of how fragile it truly was. Later that afternoon, Derek arrived at the house, carrying a stack of papers under one arm. He greeted Angela with a quick hug, before turning his attention to Marcus. "We need to talk," he said, gesturing for them to sit down in the living room. Marcus braced himself, unsure of what to expect. Was this going to be another lecture about staying safe or avoiding trouble? But as Derek settled into a chair across from him, his expression softened. "I want you to understand something," Derek began, leaning forward slightly. "What happened last night wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong, and you shouldn't feel ashamed or afraid to walk down your own street." Marcus nodded slowly, though the words didn't fully sink in. Logically, he knew his father was right, but emotionally, he couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability that clung to him like a shadow. Derek continued, his tone measured but passionate. "But here's the thing. This isn't just about you. It's about every young person who has ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. If we don't speak up, if we don't demand change, then nothing will improve. Last night gave us an opportunity to shine a light on these issues, and I think we should take it." Angela listened intently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When Derek paused, she spoke up, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "What does that mean for Marcus, though? Is he ready for this kind of attention, this kind of responsibility?" Derek hesitated, glancing at Marcus thoughtfully. "That's his decision to make," he said finally. "But if he's willing, I believe he can help inspire real change, not just here in Maplewood, but everywhere." Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat. The idea of stepping into the spotlight terrified him, but deep down he understood the weight of what his father was saying. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about using his experience to spark a larger conversation. Taking a deep breath, Marcus looked at his parents, his resolve strengthening. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's do it." Derek smiled, pride shining in his eyes. "That's my boy," he said, reaching over to squeeze Marcus's shoulder. "Together, we'll make sure this doesn't happen again." As the family sat together, planning their next steps, the ripple effect of Marcus's courage began to spread. Across town, community leaders organized meetings to discuss police reform. On social media, hashtags like "Justice for Marcus" trended nationwide. And in homes throughout Maplewood, people started having difficult conversations about race, power, and accountability. What had begun as a single moment of injustice was growing into something much bigger. A movement fueled by hope, resilience, and the unwavering belief that change was possible. And at the heart of it all was a 16-year-old boy who refused to let fear define him. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity, both within Marcus's household and across the broader community. What had once been a quiet neighborhood was now at the center of national attention, with news outlets covering every development in the case. Reporters set up camp outside the Johnson family home, their cameras trained on the modest house as if waiting for some grand revelation. Inside, however, life continued, at least as much as it could under the circumstances. Derek worked tirelessly behind the scenes, coordinating with civil rights organizations, legal teams, and local officials to ensure the investigation into the officer's actions remained transparent and thorough. He also spent hours preparing Marcus for what lay ahead, knowing full well that stepping into the public eye would come with challenges. "You don't have to be perfect," Derek reminded him one evening as they sat together in the living room. "All you have to do is tell your truth." But telling his truth wasn't easy for Marcus. The weight of being thrust into the spotlight pressed heavily on his shoulders, leaving him anxious and unsure. Would people listen? Or would they dismiss him as just another teenager caught up in controversy? These doubts gnawed at him, even as he rehearsed what he wanted to say. Finally, the day arrived when Marcus would speak publicly for the first time. A town hall meeting had been organized at Maplewood High School, drawing hundreds of attendees, residents, activists, journalists, and even politicians eager to weigh in on the growing movement sparked by Marcus's story. As the auditorium, filled with murmurs of anticipation, Marcus stood backstage with his father, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. "You've got this," Derek whispered, giving his son an encouraging pat on the back. "Just breathe and remember why you're doing this." Taking a deep breath, Marcus nodded and stepped out onto the stage. The crowd fell silent as he approached the podium, their eyes fixed on him expectantly. For a moment he froze, overwhelmed by the sheer number of people staring back at him. Then, glancing down at the notes he'd written, he began to speak. "My name is Marcus Johnson," he started, his voice trembling but clear. "And I'm here today because something happened to me that shouldn't happen to anyone, especially not in their own neighborhood." As he spoke, Marcus recounted the events of that fateful night, describing how he'd been stopped, searched, and treated like a criminal despite having done nothing wrong. His words painted a vivid picture of fear, confusion, and injustice, resonating deeply with those who listened. Some audience members wiped away tears while others nodded in agreement, their faces etched with empathy and anger. "I'm not sharing my story because I want sympathy," Marcus continued, his confidence growing with each sentence. "I'm sharing it because I know I'm not alone. There are so many others like me, young people who've been judged, mistreated, or worse simply because of how they look, and we can't let that continue." By the time he finished speaking, the auditorium erupted into applause. People rose to their feet, cheering not just for Marcus but for the courage it took to stand before them and demand change. Even seasoned activists in attendance admitted they hadn't expected such poise and conviction from someone so young. Afterward, as Marcus stepped off the stage, he was greeted by a flood of support. Strangers hugged him, thanking him for speaking out. Community leaders praised his bravery, promising to work alongside him to push for meaningful reform. And through it all, Derek watched proudly, knowing his son had taken the first step toward becoming a symbol of hope. Yet, amidst the praise and celebration, Marcus couldn't shake the lingering sense of responsibility. Speaking at the town hall was just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done. That night, as he lay in bed replaying the events of the day, he realized something important. This wasn't just about justice for himself. It was about creating a future where no one else would have to endure what he had. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Marcus knew he wasn't walking it alone. With his family by his side and a growing coalition of supporters rallying around him, he felt ready to face whatever came next. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but every step forward mattered, and Marcus was determined to keep moving. Weeks turned into months, and the ripple effect of Marcus's courage continued to spread far beyond Maplewood. The town hall meeting had ignited a fire that burned brightly across the nation, sparking conversations about racial profiling, police accountability, and systemic injustice. What began as one teenager's story had evolved into a movement, a call for change that resonated with people from all walks of life. The investigation into the officers' actions concluded with disciplinary measures being taken, though many in the community felt it wasn't enough. Still, the case served as a catalyst for broader reforms. Local officials worked alongside activists to implement new training programs for law enforcement, focusing on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. Community oversight boards were established to ensure transparency and accountability, giving residents a voice in shaping how their neighborhoods were policed. For Marcus, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. But it was a different kind of normal. He became a familiar face at rallies, panel discussions, and youth empowerment events, where his words inspired countless others to speak up against injustice. Though he never sought fame or recognition, he embraced his role as an advocate, knowing that staying silent would only perpetuate the cycle of inequality. At home, things changed too. Derek and Angela marveled at the transformation they saw in their son. Gone was the quiet, reserved teenager who preferred to blend into the background. In his place stood a young man filled with purpose, unafraid to use his voice to make a difference. "I'm proud of you," Angela told him one evening as they sat together in the kitchen. "You've grown so much through all of this." Marcus smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "It's not just me, Mom," he said softly. "There are so many other kids out there who deserve a fair chance. Kids who shouldn't have to go through what I did. I just want to help make sure they don't." His humility touched everyone around him, earning him even more respect and admiration. But Marcus remained grounded, refusing to let the attention go to his head. Instead, he channeled his energy into tangible action. With Derek's guidance, he helped launch a mentorship program aimed at supporting underprivileged youth in Maplewood. The initiative provided resources, tutoring, and career counseling, empowering young people to break free from cycles of poverty and marginalization. As the school year drew to a close, Marcus stood on stage once more, this time at his high school graduation. Clad in a cap and gown, he looked out at the sea of faces gathered in the auditorium. Among them were his parents, beaming with pride, his little sister Mia, clutching a bouquet of flowers, and dozens of friends and supporters who had rallied behind him during the darkest moments of his journey. When it was his turn to address the graduating class, Marcus took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. "Graduation is supposed to be about celebrating achievements," he began, his voice steady and strong. "But tonight I want to talk about something else, about resilience, hope, and the power of standing up for what's right." He went on to share lessons he'd learned over the past year. The importance of speaking truth to power, the strength found in vulnerability, and the impact one person can have when they choose to take a stand. By the time he finished, the room erupted into applause, echoing long after he stepped away from the podium. That night, as fireworks lit up the sky to mark the end of another chapter, Marcus reflected on how far he'd come. The scars of that fateful evening still lingered, both visible and invisible, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they reminded him of why he fought so hard, for justice, for equality, and for a future where no one else would have to endure what he had. As he stood beside his family, watching the bursts of color illuminate the night, Marcus felt a profound sense of peace. The road ahead would undoubtedly bring challenges, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone. Together, they had sparked a flame, and it would continue to burn brightly, lighting the way toward a better tomorrow.